and welcome to Investment Banking University, where we teach you how to become an investment banker. Today we're talking about the very important topic of Perpetuity Science and the Perpetuity Scientist. So, within Perpetuity Science, there are definite phases of the perpetuity that correspond to levels of development of the perpetuity, including, number one, levels of customer concentration, levels of recurring revenue, and levels of owner dependence. And so these are the three key variables associated with the de-risking of the perpetuity, which is ultimately part of the responsibilities of the CEO. So for number one, levels of customer concentration, where high levels of customer concentration correspond with a lower EBITDA multiple, and low levels of customer concentrations correspond with a high EBITDA multiple. So for two, levels of recurring revenue, where high levels of recurring revenue correspond with a high EBITDA multiple, and low levels of recurring revenue correspond with a low EBITDA multiple. And the third key de-risking variable, levels of owner dependence, is ultimately where a high level of owner dependence corresponds with a lower EBITDA multiple, and low levels of owner dependence correspond with a high EBITDA multiple. So the perpetuity scientist, the CEO or the consultant, is not only responsible for growing the benefit stream, i.e. the cash flow, but also de-risking factors that determine the discount rate, or R, which makes up our formula for the perpetuity, which is CF over R. So in doing so, the perpetuity scientist builds a highly sought after perpetuity for both strategic and financial buyers, corresponding with a premium valuation. So when the perpetuity scientist is approaching somebody trying to build a perpetuity, we first provide coverage to target a perpetuity itself and in order to originate an engagement. The perpetuity scientist should follow these steps. Number one, send the perpetuity book and a perpetuity advisor teaser to target companies. Number two, once we engage with that individual that's leading the prospective target company, we do a perpetuity analysis, an assessment of where we are now in the perpetuity phases. Number three, we solicit the goal of ownership, what phase of the perpetuity we're trying to get to, and ultimately that's going to be communicated in terms of evaluation with an implied multiple. Number four, we're going to determine the perpetuity plan and how to get there. So where are we trying to ultimately go with our goal, and how are we going to get there? How are we going to move through the different phases of the perpetuity to get there? And so that's going to be characterized as multiples at each phase of the perpetuity and how to get there. And then number five, finally, is the perpetuity plan and the execution of how we actually do that, and that's where the real value is created. So in order to assess where we are now, we are going to be looking at the perpetuity phases, multiples, and the market for the perpetuity chart, which we have here. And we're ultimately going to see at the bottom of the chart, we have the stage of the perpetuity as characterized by number one, syndication, two, job shop, three, perpetuity, four, growing perpetuity, or five, diversified. And as you can see along the left-hand side, we have different variables here, which are key de-risking factors. So the first one is customer concentration, and that moves from high at the bottom to low at the top. Recurring revenue, high at the bottom, low at the top once again. And dependence on the owner, high at the bottom and low at the top. And these correspond to different multiples. So as we move from high customer concentration to low customer concentration, that corresponds with a higher EBITDA multiple, which is going to reflect in the chart here as we move higher in the chart. As we see the stage of the perpetuity going from 1 to 5, from syndication to diversified, we ultimately see a movement in the EBITDA multiple going from very low to very high. And so this is very important for analyzing, number one, where we are now. So are we at a job shop? Are we at a perpetuity stage? Are we at syndication stage? And where do we ultimately want to be? And how do we get there? The answer to that question is not only by growing the benefit stream, the cash flow, but by working on these key de-risking factors, namely customer concentration, recurring revenue, and dependence on the owner. And that's how we ultimately create a plan. So now we can detail what each stage of the perpetuity ultimately looks like. And so number one, syndication, getting to PMT, our first payment, and initial revenue generation is the focus. So the key here is taking a concept that has a large enough total addressable market and turning it into a single sale as represented by PMT. This demonstrates product market fit between the minimum viable product or platform and allows the owner to invest additional time, energy, and resources into turning the syndication ultimately into a perpetuity. So the syndication's value to the owner will be related to the NPV or DCF value. However, since there's an inefficient market for syndications, which we see in this chart, the value is going to be discounted at a very high rate, or an R. 80 to 100%, depending on the potential buyer for the syndication. So the syndication is entirely reliant on the owner's active involvement, and if the owner no longer works in the syndication ceases to operate. So the market here is inefficient. As we move on to the job shop, this is a transition in terms of a formula from PMT1 to ultimately going to separate, disparate PMT2, PMT3. So this is the initial efforts to create a job shop. So the key here is taking a syndication that has demonstrated product market fit and turning it into a job shop with multiple projects as represented by PMT1, PMT2, PMT3. This demonstrates product market fit between the minimum viable product and allows for the owner to invest additional time like this indication. So the job shop's valuation is based upon a multiple of its EBITDA and is usually in the range of 3 to 5x, 3 to 5 times EBITDA. The job shop is not entirely reliant on the owner's active involvement, and thus there is a larger, albeit still inefficient, market for the prospective perpetuity, with buyers, likely buyers, being individuals and lower middle market strategic and financial buyers. So the owner's primary responsibility is to first turn the company into a project or a job shop, and then the company is looked at as solely as the sum of the value of its projects and jobs, meaning that the valuation of the company is ultimately backward looking. So as we begin to move from job shop to perpetuity, the formula for valuing the company is ultimately going to change, as well as our key de-risking variables. So the perpetuity, or the third phase of the perpetuity, is going from PMT, like separate PMTs, transitioning into a durable cash flow stream is characterized by recurring revenue. And that's why we transition from PMT to CF over R, or our benefit stream over our discount rate. And that is ultimately how we make that transition. So transitioning from a job shop to a recurring revenue stream is ultimately what we're trying to look for here. And this is what strategic and financial buyers are ultimately looking for, is a durable benefit stream with manageable and the possibility to continue de-risking the key factors that we've discussed, the three of them. So the key here is taking a job shop with disparate projects, PMT1, PMT2, PMT3, and turning it into a perpetuity with a predictable, if not recurring, benefit stream. The perpetuity's value is based upon a larger EBITDA multiple, since there is a semi-strong efficient market. And we'll talk a little bit about that later for perpetuities, with likely buyers being middle market strategic and financial buyers. The perpetuity is almost entirely not reliant on the owner's active involvement. And from here, the owner is to turn the company into a perpetuity is characterized by the recurring revenue. This can be done by building an organizational structure with division of labor, automated processes with technology, and a business model that is recurring by nature. When this is accomplished, the valuation becomes forward-looking, and that's why we get to CF over R. The key here is taking a perpetuity with a durable benefit stream, CF, and a reasonable amount of variability in the benefit stream, R, and turning it into a growing perpetuity, which is number 4, growing perpetuity. So we move and transition from CF over R, the formula for the perpetuity, to CF over R minus G, which is the growing perpetuity. That G is the growth rate associated with the growing perpetuity, which decreases R, our denominator, which makes our valuation of the perpetuity higher when we decrease the denominator. So we're going from a recurring revenue stream to a growing perpetuity, or a growing recurring revenue stream is ultimately what we're looking for. The perpetuity's value is based on an even larger EBITDA multiple, since there is a weak form efficient market for growing perpetuities, with likely buyers being middle market strategic and financial buyers, and in fact some public strategic and financial buyers are entering the market for growing perpetuities as well. The growing perpetuity is almost entirely not reliant on the owner's active involvement, one of the key de-risking variables. And so this can be accomplished by building a scalable platform as part of the core business. The valuation of the company now has to incorporate a growth factor like we talked about in the formula. And then the final phase of a perpetuity is in fact diversified. When we have attained the perpetuity one, the first perpetuity, we can add a second perpetuity or continue to build it from a syndication into a perpetuity. So from one growing perpetuity to a growing another perpetuity organically, or purchasing one to grow inorganically are different options that we have here. So finally, the owner is to diversify either organically, new product business, or inorganically via corporate M&A or private equity if you're a private equity buyer. So if diversification is organic, the new product or business will naturally move through the phases of the perpetuity once again: syndication, project or job shop, perpetuity, and then ultimately growing perpetuity. Since the valuation is forward-looking, it has to incorporate the new product or business financial performance. Since the parent company is now becoming diversified, the discount rate continues to decrease, which adds value to the parent company. And so that is Perpetuity Science as a whole. We go much deeper in detail and actually get into the modeling of it and the building of perpetuities in the course How to Become an Investment Banker at Investment Banking University. So you can download the book Investment Banking at investmentbankingu.com and learn all about this. We look forward to seeing you in the course, either online on the weekend format or in the month-long training.